Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel we're going to talk all about the prospect for a full-blown high-intensity civil conflict here on the North American continent. A recent survey done by the Washington Examiner found that 61% of people thought that the possibility, or the probability I should say, for a civil conflict was very, very high, and that 52% were actively preparing for this to happen. So we're going to break that down today. We're going to talk about whether or not it's realistic, whether or not the term civil war is grossly oversimplified, which it is, and we're going to talk about what you can expect in the next few months. So stick with me, because I'm assuring you right now that there's a lot of perspective in this video that you're not going to hear anywhere else. So let's get to it. The concept of civil war is a grossly oversimplified term, and we should probably just stop using it altogether, because unfortunately what happens in people's minds when you say the term civil war, well, for one, they remember the war in the 1800s between the South and the North, and it's going to resemble nothing like that. If you look at lots of the civil conflicts around the world, whether that be in Syria or Iraq, a lot of the more modern conflicts, you see between a half dozen and a dozen groups vying for power over those regions. And those groups are broken into smaller subgroups and tribes or factions, which are also going to be competing with one another. This idea that it's just going to be this bifurcation of the left and right, and that there's going to be two encampments warring with one another, is nonsense in the modern age. It's simply not going to look like that. Now, there is one scenario that I'm going to talk about which might resemble that somewhat, but there's still going to be a huge variance in terms of the opinion and the ideology and the politics and the religious leanings of all the people involved in that sort of skirmish. So we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, you need to understand that we live in a global world. That should be, obvious to anybody who's on the World Wide Web watching this video. We live in a democracy. Well, you could call it that. Some people might argue that and say, no, it's by and large driven by corporate multinational lobbyist interests, and that the politicians are just puppets. Okay, maybe it's a bit of a facade. Nonetheless, we have the illusion of choice, okay? We're told that Pepsi and Coke are different, and, we have that choice to buy either or, even though they by and large taste the same. We live in this thing called a democracy here in North America and many Western societies and other countries around the world. And there are these other things called autocracies, basically tyrannical, panoptical surveillance states that exist around the world, where you have one person who's in charge, and they stay in power at term after term after term, whether legitimate or illegitimate. And that both of these systems, democracy and autocracy, are at odds with one another, of course, and that there's attempts to undermine each other. So within a democracy, we live in a glass house. If you compare the United States to a country like China, the United States is like a naked person who's fully exposed, whereas China's in full battle armor, okay? And I say that because of the Great Firewall, the internet firewall, which censors and heavily regulates everything that the public there is exposed to and told about the world. Whereas here, it's an open book. We live in a glass house, and as they say, you shouldn't throw stones if you live in one, right? And unfortunately, we've thrown a lot of stones in this glass house that we live in this past year. Which makes it incredibly easy for foreign powers to come in and try to subvert and undermine and lead to even more instability within the country. So they can work to effectively destabilize North American society even more, and basically amplify these divisions that we're seeing, whether it's between BLM and Antifa and these militia groups and whatnot, getting everybody fighting together even more. And they do that via the internet, which anybody can access. Yet it's very hard for the reverse to be true. It's very hard for a lot of democracies to try to undermine autocracies in that way, because autocracies have these authoritarian controls in place which restrict the ingress of that information. So they export, but they don't import, whereas democracies import and export information. In a sense, we're at a great disadvantage then as a democracy, even though democracy affords us a lot of other things which empower us in many ways. We're at a disadvantage when it comes to fourth generational warfare, which is basically trying to win the hearts and minds of the people, essentially. So what worries me the most right now is that while we have these divisions and this low intensity conflict going on in the streets with the rioters and the exchanges between, the militia groups and the left, while we have that, what's going to take it to the next level could very well be that provocation from online trolls, who are commissioned by their countries of origin. And it simply would not be hard for you to conscript thousands of people to go and write comments on the internet every day and whip people into a frenzy and get people fighting and infiltrate various groups and actually, become a directive force within those groups in order to, like I said, destabilize the country. You don't need to send people money or anything like that. You don't have to have any really active role. Just be an anonymous person on the internet who is actively working to chip away at the fabric and the solidarity of the North American public. That's the biggest threat to democracy in the modern age. This is a threat that's never been there before in the past because we didn't have the internet. It was very hard to affect public opinion in other countries without dropping pamphlets from airplanes, without dropping propaganda leaflets. Okay, that's the only way you could do that in the past. Nowadays, you basically have an open book, to do that on the internet. So unfortunately then, all our divisions are going to be potentially amplified by these online provocateurs. And it's definitely happening. We know it's happening. Now, the other problem we face is with respect to the technopoly which runs our lives. Not the technocracy. I mistakenly used the term technocracy to describe our world in a recent video, and I apologize for that. The term technocracy relates to a society run by the principles of science, where you have your most intelligent people basically making very objectivist, stoic decisions about what should happen in a way which is potentially amoral and even unethical in some instances, but you're doing what you're doing for the sake of being empirical alone. We don't have that. We live in a democracy where it's basically majority rules, even though you could argue it isn't, as I previously mentioned. But we have this issue of the technopoly. Now, there's many of these social media giants from which you get information, whether it's Google, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. All of these companies have created algorithms which are optimized to basically sell you advertising. And in doing so, the main aim is to try to hold your attention for as long as possible. And what this amounts to is what they call a virtual bubble, or a highly personalized search, whereby your search history and your preferences are factored into the results that get shown. As such, that what you search for on the internet, what you find, if I made that same search, I would get different search results based on my search history and my preferences, because the goal of the company is to keep you engaged on the platform. And they do that by serving you up more of the same, by more of what you like. If they serve you up something which you're not going to like, or which is going to run counter to your beliefs, they know that you're going to be averse to that, and that you're probably not going to engage on the platform as much. So there's a vested interest in giving people more of the same, and this has the effect of making us more polarized as a society, because we then create these massive echo chambers where it appears that everybody in the world, from our perspective, is thinking a certain way, is thinking like we do, when that's not the reality at all, okay? A person who is in the right-wing sphere on the internet sees a completely different internet on YouTube than a person who is in the left-wing political sphere, okay? We're seeing completely different things because the algorithm is feeding you more of the same. This is very problematic, and it's only going to intensify in the future. So we have these two things, one which is actively trying to foment unrest in North America, and then we have this other thing where we're doing it to ourselves, where we're becoming more divided in our beliefs and opinions and polarized because of how the algorithms are set up. So the odds are really stacked against us and stacked in the favor of some kind of civil unrest breaking out. Again, it's not going to be a situation where you have one camp versus another. It's going to be a bunch, it's just going to be a mess, okay, if it ever actually went down like that. So we have everybody becoming a lot more insular in their opinions and thinking that all the world agrees with them. And if you're on the right now, from your perspective, all you're seeing is good polls about Trump being ahead. And if you're on the left right now, all you're seeing is polls about, Biden being ahead. So everybody is going to have this expectation that their candidate is going to come out on top, and that could lead to a highly contested election on election day. Now let's talk a bit about what that might potentially look like. There's a lot of talk of, okay, there's going to be states who are going to secede from the union if Trump gets elected, and states will secede from the union if Biden gets elected, and there's going to be a balkanization of the United States, and you see all these maps online of what that might actually look like. The problem with secession is that any state that wants to do that really has to look at the cost-benefit analysis of doing that, and I think that the costs of doing it would just be so high, especially if you still lived in a democracy and you knew that there's a potential for a government change in 4 years. I just can't see any states going through with something like that. But then again, anything could happen. Things could spiral out of control rather quickly. So let's talk about what an actual civil war might look like. And there's so many different dimensions to this and so many different ways that it could actually go. Okay, if we're talking about a low intensity civil unrest, I think we've already seen that, where you have different groups, a step above just simply going to the voting booth and voting from their candidate. They're actually protesting and rioting in the streets, and there's people of another ideological ilk that they're fighting in the streets. Okay, we've seen some skirmishes. Not many in the grand scheme of things, but there's been a few. That's a more low intensity situation. Now, to get that up to a high intensity situation where there's frequent armed engagements between different groups, there's going to have to be some Franz Ferdinand type moment for that to actually transpire. Something like that is not going to transpire without some incident. Just like we've seen with the George Floyd situation, there needs to be an incident to kick that all off. Now, there's a few ways I could see this going. If the election was highly contested, and let's say that Trump won, or at least thought he won, and then later when mail-in ballots came in, it was decided that he didn't win, I could see that being one of those scenarios which could definitely lead to a lot of pissed off people on the right who then feel disenfranchised. So here's the problem with the other autocracies of the world trying to undermine the Western democracies, is that eventually we're going to have to implement some sort of authoritarian strategy to crack down on this destabilization. Okay, this is the case. This is what we've seen in other countries for years, where the dictator has to crack down on the protesters who are being goaded by forces from the outside world. We've seen this happen in many countries over the last 5 years, is that dictators have to crack down on protests because they realize that these protests are being fomented by foreigners, by foreign influence. And eventually, we're going to understand that that's happening here. Now, how we deal with that in a way which is democratic and in line with our ethics as a freedom-loving society. I say we because, you know, Canada and the United States are by and large the same country. I've went into details as to why before. I'm not going to go into that in every single video that I talk about the United States. But hopefully we can find a way to effectively limit foreign influence in terms of the civil unrest that's happening. I doubt we will. I think that the approach is going to be an authoritarian one. And that's why if Trump gets elected, what you're likely going to see is the government taking on more of those autocratic styles of governance in order to combat the undermining from foreign autocratic governments. Okay, because that's really all you can do. I mean, if there's countries who are trying to destabilize your country by spreading misinformation and fake news and propaganda, then the only way to really get control of that is to be the authority, right? The law and order president. And some people are going to embrace this. For others, it's going to look like martial law and it's going to come off as very tyrannical. And it's not going to go over well with a lot of people, which is going to ratchet up the tensions even more. Now, if Biden wins, on the other hand, and there is a reluctance to dignify or honor the Biden presidency as the legitimate president, then I'm talking about by the militia groups, by like the 600,000 some odd militias who are all supported by dozens of people who support them. And I can't remember the exact statistic, but in most of these civil style conflicts, it's a very few people who are actually on the front lines fighting in battle. It's a very small portion of the population, like a couple percent, and they're actually just being supported by dozens of people. Each individual combatant is supported by dozens of people. So in the Biden victory scenario, if you do have secession or defection from the right on a grassroots type level, and that leads to conflict, that would be the one scenario I think you might actually have a traditional style civil war in. If Biden was able to demonstrate that there's a legitimate undermining of the Constitution by these militia groups, and they're able to get the support of the military, or at least a significant portion of it, that's the only situation I think you'd get a respectable civil conflict where you had two sides generally fighting with one another. And of course, many people are going to defect from the military because these situations are very complex when you're talking about civil matters, because people who are in the militia are going to know people in the military. They're going to have family in the military. So there's going to be all of this overlap, which is why it's very difficult for these things to come about unless you're talking about people who live in entirely different states fighting with one another. I can't see it happening where you have people, you know, from the same towns and cities fighting together. This is why fighting wars in other countries is easier, because the enemy is dehumanized. You don't know them. They look different from you. It's easier to fight somebody like that. It's harder if the person you're fighting, you know, watches the same TV shows you do and is cheerleading the same sports team, right? Now, while I think that that's possible, I think it's highly improbable that things ever get to the point where you're going to have, you know, like a Biden is Lincoln type scenario, which is ironic because he's a Democrat and Lincoln was a Republican. But it's very unlikely you're going to see a scenario like that where you have Biden, who's won the support of the military, to crack down on these unruly militia groups who aren't, you know, playing ball with the Biden administration, for whatever that means, whatever that looks like. I think it's very unlikely that we see that happen. And I also think it's very unlikely that civil war erupts if Trump gets elected, but there's definitely going to be a civil unrest, and there's going to be an attempt to destabilize the North American continent, because the goal is to bump the United States out as the world's reserve currency, to bump them out of first place as the global superpower. That's the end goal. And however that can be done, you know, there will be people who would like to see that happen, who are autocracies, because democracy is a threat to autocracy. So there's a vested interest in destabilizing North American politics. So the question is then, is how is this going to affect the average, moderate, middle of the road person? And I think it could potentially affect you, of course, if there is violence in the streets, if martial law is enacted down the line, or if there is secession or balkanization or, local uprisings or whatever the case might be. Obviously, that's a security threat to you. It could also affect you in terms of supply chain disruptions, because the more unrest there is, the more potential there's going to be for supply chain disruptions, especially if the rift widens internationally, okay? And if there is a war that breaks out between China and Taiwan around the time of the election or shortly thereafter, which could potentially happen because they're certainly pressure testing the Taiwanese defenses on a daily basis. So it's safe to say that an incursion is probably inevitable, based on what we've seen in Hong Kong and based on what we've seen, the lengths that they would go to there. It seems like it's inevitable. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen. They're probably not going to do it before the election, because that could potentially improve Trump's chance of getting reelected, and I don't think they want that. They probably won't do it around the time of the election if it's being contested, because then that could bring into play the whole continuity of government idea, that if there is a global crisis occurring, then the acting president can enact, I can't remember the exact laws or legislations that accompany it, but there's some kind of clause, like a continuity of government thing, where the person can stay in power to at least deal with the issues that have to be dealt with. And I'm not sure how that plays in, if that means they stay for a full 4 years or what the case might be. I'm losing my voice because this is actually the second time I did this video. The first time my microphone wasn't on, and that was the best take ever. So this take is probably gonna suck. Anyways, guys, I think the best thing you can do right now is just remain vigilant. Remember that if you're seeing people get very radicalized and more extreme in their views, there's a chance that it's the result of the algorithm feeding you more of the same. And I would encourage you to do what I do, which is to subscribe to YouTube channels from both sides of the political spectrum, even if you disagree with them, because that's going to give you a more objective view of what is actually going on in the world, a more realistic perspective of what's going on in the world. Anyways, guys, please share your perspective in the comment section below. Try to keep it civil, try to be respectful, and let's not let our emotions and just the excitement of this whole situation get the best of us and interfere with our ability to find some common ground. Thanks for watching, guys. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. Your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SURVIVALPREPPER. All one word in all caps.